Hello, my name is Quintessence, and I am a developer advocate at PagerDuty, and I'm here to talk to you about sensory-friendly monitoring and how you can keep your noise down. Before I get started, I'm just going to have you make sure that you have your Echo devices that are in listening range on mute or use headphones. And if you're wondering why, don't worry, we'll get to that later. First things first, what happens when we try to know everything? It looks a little bit like this. It's heavily chaotic. And we start with good intentions, right? We're like, oh, we should know what's going on in Confluence, or oh, we need to know about Trello or Jira or whatever it is we're using. Oh no, we need to have something on our phone notifications. And very quickly it just balloons, kind of like that, because every time you add a source, you're adding everything in that source. And this can get dangerous very quickly. Too much noise buries important and higher severity alerts, because if everything is coming at you with the same tone level, so to speak, everything seems equally important, and then you're going to treat it all as background noise. Or you'll just mute the notification or its source, and if you're muting things even though they're still chatty, that means you or the people that you need to be notified won't be notified, right? But when you do that mute, you're making everything quiet because you think, I want quiet, but you don't actually reduce that anxiety, because it's not true quiet, it's artificial quiet. And deep down, you know that it's artificial quiet. So we need to find a way to hit a middle place where it is quiet enough for us to focus, but we're still hearing what we need to hear. And in order to kind of emphasize why that's so important, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the cost of noise on your brain. You weren't planning to learn some brain stuff today, were you? So your brain on alerts. Our brains are filtering just so much background noise, and we don't even know that it's doing it. But think about this. If you've ever lived with another human, siblings, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, etc., you get the point. You might find that you are able to talk to things that they know about, even if you've never cracked a book, listened to a podcast, or anything else about that topic, because they're talking in your environment. They're listening to it in your environment. And even though you think you're filtering it out so that you can focus and read your own stuff, it's still making its way in. So your brain is still multitasking, even though you don't think that it is. And these interruptions can mean a lot. So let's talk about a brief interruption. And this is the type of interruption that can be like Joe developer comes up and asks you what the Wi-Fi password is. This is not an interruption that causes you to redirect your attention entirely. You're not, for example, rebooting a Kubernetes cluster or something like that. You're just doing a brief, addressing the question that you're being asked, and then redirecting your attention back to what you're doing before. That type of redirect is a 25-minute loss. And let's talk about why. It was actually Gloria Mark at UC Irvine who studied this. And what they found is your brain is trying to rebuild its state from before you were interrupted. But you've also had a change in state. Now you're thinking about, well, let's say it's not the Wi-Fi password. It's, hey, did you read the news? That's a can of worms. Even if it's not truly distracting, now something is firing in the back of your brain where you're thinking about what you were just asked, even if you're no longer addressing the question. And because of this, not only are you losing time trying to rebuild your state, you're also not really truly able to get back to the state that you were in. And this can have other implications too, like degradation in quality. So this is a different study that was done at George Mason University on AP test scores. So for those unfamiliar, AP tests are actually graded 0 to 5, with 5 being high. And what they found is, let's say that they did the written portion of a test and that you do a small interruption. And they found that the AP test score dropped by 0.5 point, half a point, which on that grading scale is very significant. But then they said, oh, we're aware of Gloria Marx's study because it happened after. And then they said, okay, let's give them the 25 minutes back. And actually 96% of those who got their time back did not do any better. Only 4% did, which means you got your time back and it didn't matter. So even when you're factoring in that you're getting these 25-minute losses, you're not actually truly able to recover. And that's highly important to high interrupt professions like we have. We're getting interrupted all the time. Walk-up Slacks, we'll say not Twitter, but Twitter, and so forth. So then Michigan State decided to study multitasking, and the type of task that they decided to study was a repetitive task. That is to say, they weren't Googling how to secure Kubernetes, they were doing things like writing lines, like you would as a student. The same sentence over and over and over again, very repetitive, basic task. And so they decided to do interruptions on the task, and they found that their error rate tripled. So even in simple tasks that don't require your focus, you're still getting increased errors just because of little interruptions like this. And when you think about these little interruptions, they're not just about people asking the Wi-Fi password, they are all the notifications that we're getting, the notifications we need to be getting, and the notifications we maybe don't need to be getting. So we need to reduce this noise. And how do we reduce this noise? First things first, be aware of the sources of the noise. Try not to be overwhelmed. At first, it will be overwhelming because you're going to want to just suppress all of it at once. It's a lot, especially when things start to snowball. But if you're focusing more on awareness, you'll be able to more mindfully navigate the next bit, which is determining the sources of your noise. In order to start saying, I can mute this, I can pivot that, you need to know where it's coming from. You also need to know what type of noise that it is, right? So not all types of noise are created equal, and you need to know that. And once you have where it's coming from and what type it is, you can start to make a flow. How loudly do you need to be notified and where? And then you can train yourself, your team, and others on where you should be checking for certain types of notifications and have single sources of information, useful for everyone. And you're also going to need a routine to clear things out. And as a quick recap for anyone who likes to take screenshots of slide, source, type, channel, routine. Now for the sources of noise, it gets complicated very quickly. Even in this very simple minimal surface diagram that I have here, you have like Confluence and Elasticsearch, Slack, Gmail, PagerDuty, AWS, GitHub, and they're all talking to each other probably, right? But there's also a little image on the side there, and that's you, because you also need to be aware of yourself and how you're adding to your own dysfunction of noise. Think about this. Even while you're streaming this talk remotely, how you doing? How often did you pull up email? How often did you check Twitter or your text message or iMessage or anything like that? How often did you just do another task? How many of you are streaming this while you're working, just to have something in the background, maybe to make working from home a little less isolating feeling, right? You are multitasking, right? And this also goes back to why I had this in the beginning, because something that happens when we're having all these remote meetings is we're not always aware of our home environments. And if, let's say, I'm co-presenting with someone who has the name Alexa, or if I'm just going to briefly troll you, I could say, Alexa, add listen to presentation to my list. And now I've just added listen to my presentation to your list. And that can cause chaos. Coworkers control you. Sometimes it's in fun, sometimes it's less so. So be aware of your own environment and what other devices are listening. You know, it could be an Echo, it could be a Google Home, it could be anything. And it's also helpful if you're aware of any background noise you're contributing to the call too. For instance, if you have dogs or cats or children running around, you might want to put on your headphones and have them canceling noise, or use something like Crisp. Now, back to communication and boundaries though. When you're trying to reduce the noise that's kind of more human-oriented, you need to start to set times to focus and figure out a way to mute the non-critical alerts. This includes messages from people, other people, friends, family, work acquaintances, and so forth. And you're going to need to tell them what a relevant emergency is. So if someone sees focus time on your calendar, then you're going to want to tell them, okay, I know that I'm unavailable, but really though, if the kid needs to go to the hospital, you need to tell me. So you need to say, you know, what is an emergency to me? What is interruptible for me, right? Within my home environment, within my work environment. You also need to be able to set reasonable expectations for yourself. If you're in a place where you can assume good intent, people aren't trying to interrupt you to make your life miserable or to make their lives miserable. They're doing it because there's a disconnect either in the communicated expectation, or they thought it was more emergency than it was, or something like that. So just be reasonable and compassionate and just keep plowing through. And again, as a recap, Make sure that you're focusing, make sure you define a relevant emergency, and make sure that's for friends, family, as well as coworkers, and set those reasonable expectations. Now let's talk about external sources of noise. Relevantly, PagerDuty alerts, right? You're going to get notifications from your systems or whatever else if something's going on. You can categorize this type of noise. They're going to be false positives, false negatives, fragile systems, frequent issues, and in that case, you can just fix it. So when you're talking about these different types of categories, let's say you have a lot of false positives on something. If you know that something is creating a lot of false positives or negatives in the opposite and almost worse sense, you need to start adjusting your alerts. Is the alert telling you what you think it is? Are you alerting on what you need to be alerting on to see the issue case that you're trying to hit? If a system is fragile, do you need that kind of alert for it? Because if it's just a flappy service, then what it's sending out is likely not as high priority as would be immediately assumed. If it's a frequent issue and it's a fixable issue, you can just fix it. So rather than focusing on the alert side, focus on the resolution size. And once you have all of that, you need to create a flow, right? So we talk about like the false positive and negatives. Let's focus in on the alerts that we want to keep. What do we want to keep? And who needs to know about it? How quickly should they know about it? And in what way should they be notified about it? So when we're looking at this, let's think about something like a very basic, let's say an EC2 instance. Let's say working in a small place, and we're treating that EC2 instance as like a web server. And it's the only thing for our small mom and shop, we'll say it's a candy store. And we don't really need it going everywhere. We just need to go to the sysadmin for that particular EC2 instance. If I'm working in HR, or I'm working in front-end design or whatever, I don't need to know if the web server starts throwing 500 errors, but the sysad does. So if you have set up your alert system to say, ping everybody because our primary mode of business is down. I mean, yes, your primary mode of business is down, but you have a lot of people who can't action the type of notification that you've decided to send out. And now they're going to miss things that they need to be paying attention to because it is relevant to them. And you also want to make sure you're not making the other mistake of treating everything like an emergency, because when everything is an emergency, nothing's an emergency, including how your brain is going to start to interpret what that means. So if I get everything on my phone as a phone call, right? Like I am the overnight on call for this week for, we'll say, the AWS region that I'm specified in or whatever. And if everything is coming through to me, every hiccup, everything is coming to me as a phone call, I'm going to turn off my phone. Probably. Because I'm not going to get what I need out of that interaction anyway. If I'm getting pinged every time there's a spike in traffic, even if that spike in traffic does not correlate to any sort of negative impact to users, or it doesn't correlate to anything at all, maybe it's expected. Maybe we expected increased user traffic because it's normal working hours for that time zone, right? If I expect it, again, having a bunch of phone calls about it, it's telling me stuff I already know. It's not actually a problem. So I should only get phone calls when I need to really react to it immediately. I can get something like Slack messages or some other chat for something that I need to know, but maybe later. Like if I need something that happened overnight that I don't need to wake up to take action on, if it goes to chat or email, I can just check it when I go into work the next morning. And this applies to all sorts of noise flow issues. That said, while you're making everything lean, it's important to have the ability to be a little redundant. And the example I like to give for this is a few years ago, Slack had an outage that I think lasted 3 hours. It was during the summer in the middle of the working day, right? So if you think about this, okay, let's say that someone set up their platform to set a bunch of notifications through just to Slack. And worse, they didn't have the ability to reconfigure their endpoints. So now they're sending everything to Slack. They can't switch it to another chat platform or to email or to phone or to anything. Slack is out for 3 hours. Odds are higher than they would ordinarily be that if I have an outage, it's going to overlap with Slack's outage. And now I won't know. And this goes back to anxious Squidward not having trustable silence, because now a third-party service provider, their outage is potentially impacting me. So when you're building all of these things, make sure that you can flip to other services. Don't vendor lock yourself or try to avoid vendor lockings yourself. So that way you can switch things out if something starts to misbehave on the regular. And this goes back to building that trust. If you know that silence means silence and it's not artificial vacuum, when you disconnect, you can truly disconnect. Now, in order to make sure you can truly disconnect, you need to be paying attention to those tools and services. A lot of us are becoming increasingly reliant on third-party tools, services, libraries, packages, etc. And we need to know the status of those things. If they're not having the same level of uptime as they used to have a year ago, 5 years ago, or how long we've been using them, we need to be able to switch. Or we will be locked into a vendor that may not be serving us the way that we want to. We don't want to go overboard though, right? Like if we want to have maybe the ability to switch from chat option A to chat option B, we don't necessarily need to say, let's make the ability to switch to infinite chat programs. We don't want to over-engineer it. We want to hit the boundary and stay there. Basically, we want to be able to switch endpoints in the event of a service outage and use that same mechanism to switch permanently if it becomes bad enough to warrant that behavior. And then again, regularly evaluate all of these services. They're not all external though. Not all of them are those third-party vendor. They could be internal ones that we wrote for ourselves. And if we're not maintaining it, or if we want to no longer maintain it so that we can switch to a third-party service, that is again part of everything that we need to outline in this section, okay? So again, remember how reliable are your tools and services, skipping to the bottom, how regular are you evaluating to make sure that they are reliable, and gut checking that. Make sure that you have some duplication, but don't go too much with it. Just make sure that you have enough so you can switch if the third-party service or internal service has an outage. And before I let you all go today, let's talk about what I'm calling sprint cleaning. And the idea in the naming here is to actually do this on a regular cadence, maybe like a sprint meeting. So the idea is for every alert that's triggered, ask, was it needed? Was it resolved? Is it automated and resolved? And is it permanent? And how urgently was that fix needed? So the idea here, don't do it while the incident is still active, but after it's resolved, just ask yourself, did I even need this? Was it even an incident? Did I get a notification or an alert that didn't correspond to any problems? And if not, okay, then I don't need this. You need to start to feel comfortable deleting things. I think sometimes it feels cathartic and other times it feels very anxiety provoking to delete things, but realistically, you need to be able to delete things. So if you need to delete it, delete it. But if you need to keep it, figure out how it was resolved, because if it's resolved in a way that changes, say, the endpoint, and if you're alerting on an endpoint that's no longer valid or has been changed or the interaction with it has changed, then you're going to need to keep that metric or that piece updated so that it's keeping pace to the changes that you've made in your infra or your code. Otherwise, you've just unintentionally created probably a flappy service or what will look like a flappy service because it's no longer behaving the way that you originally intended. Now, if you want to do some additional reading on some of the studies I've referenced in here, I have some slides and such on Noticed. And after all that, thank you so much for your time and attention. Again, my name is Quintessence, and I'm a developer advocate at PagerDuty.